All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. It's great to have you all here. A few people are still filing in. So before we dive in with formal introductions, I'm just going to give a quick few bits of housekeeping for all of us to follow today. The first is that you'll find the chat and Q&A functions at the bottom of your screen for those of you who've never used Zoom before, which I would anticipate is not many. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A, please do use the Q&A function below. And if you'd like to introduce yourself to the room and just share a bit about why you're here today, please do so in the chat. We'd love to get the conversation going there as well. You can also engage in the conversation on Twitter if you are a social media influencer. Our Twitter handle is @Ada Lovelace Inst, and the UK Stats Regulation Twitter handle is at Stats Regulation. There are closed captions available. You can turn on the subtitles by clicking the CC closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. And alternatively, you can view fully adjustable subtitles via the stream text, which will be dropped in the chat shortly. Great. Okay, I feel like most of us are here. So welcome everyone to this conversation today on building public confidence in data-driven systems with the Ada Lovelace Institute and the Office for Statistics Regulation. My name is Andrew Strait. I'm the Associate Director of Research Partnerships here at the Ada Lovelace Institute. Those of us who don't know Ada, we are an independent research and deliberative body based in London with a mission to ensure that data and AI work for society. In March 2020, education ministers in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland closed schools as part of the UK's response to the COVID-19 outbreak. Government announcements confirmed that public examinations would not take place in summer 2020, and the UK's 4 qualification regulators, Ofqual, the Scottish Qualifications Authority, Qualifications Wales, and the Council for the Curriculum, Examinations, and Assessment in Northern Ireland were directed to develop an approach to awarding grades in the absence of exams. While each qualification body adopted a different approach, all of them involved the use of statistical algorithms to assess and award grades. Now, I personally just so happened to be in Westminster on the morning of August 6, 2020, a day when students from across the UK marched through Parliament Square and to number 10 Downing Street, chanting a now infamous cry, which I will not repeat here, about those algorithms. In the end, the algorithmically determined scores were dropped, and the grades in all 4 countries were reissued based on the grades that schools and colleges had originally submitted. The Ofqual A-level exam results algorithm prompted wide societal debate about the conditions that would engender public trust and confidence in data-driven systems. In this event today, the Office for Statistics Regulation will share findings from their UK-wide review of the exam models deployed in 2020, focusing on the importance of confidence in models, specific factors that impacted on confidence in the A-level algorithm, and drawing on lessons for the future. The Office for Statistics Regulation is a key UK regulator charged with increasing public confidence in the trustworthiness, quality, and value of statistics by articulating standards and shaping good practice. The Ada Lovelace Institute will also share some insights today from a diverse profile of public engagement and deliberation work that we undertook during 2020 on the conditions that engender public confidence in data and related technologies at times of public health emergency and beyond. I'm very excited to say that we're joined by 4 wonderful speakers today. First, I'd like to introduce Gail Rankin, who leads OSR's program of systemic reviews for the UK and also heads up its office in Edinburgh. Gail's background is in engineering and project management, and she joined OSR from a career in local government, data, and performance. My colleague Reema Patel is also with us here today. She is Ada's Associate Director of Engagement. Reema has worked for the organization from its establishment as part of its founding team. She leads Ada's public attitudes and public deliberation research and its broader engagement work on justice and equalities. Ed Humpherson is the Director General for Regulation at the Office for Statistics and Regulation, and along with Michael Hodge, the Head of Data and Automation at the Office for Statistics Regulation, they'll be joining us for a Q&A panel at the end of the day. We'll start from some presentations from Gail and Reema on the findings from the research into Ofqual. So I'll hand it now to Gail Rankin to kick us off. think we might be having a few difficulties connecting Gail. We should be with her. Should be with us shortly.
Would it help, Andrew, if I just, is Ed Humpherson here, I just said a few words whilst Gail tries to reconnect, rather than have everybody sitting around awkwardly. So first of all, let me just introduce us as the OSR. So we are the regulatory arm of the UK Statistics Authority, and our formal statutory role is to promote and safeguard production and publication of official statistics. One crucial point that I always make in our presentations is that we don't actually produce any statistics, and that we're actually quite separate from the ONS, and a big chunk of our work is overseeing, regulating, if you will, the work of ONS. And those of you who are interested in demography will know that we published quite a critical report about ONS on Monday of this week about how they compile population estimates for some parts of the country. So we're separate from ONS, and we essentially hold all parts of government to account for the way they produce and publish statistics and data. And you see on the right hand side of the screen there some of the tools we use. The main one actually is the Code of Practice for Statistics. That's our kind of it's got a sort of like foundational role for us. It's an absolutely central set of principles that we guide all our work. And then we do a range of other things. Confer the National Statistics designation. We do reviews across whole systems like adult social care, and we are known for stepping into the public domain when we have concerns about the use of data. And there's a screenshot there from a headline: UK Statistics Watchdog warns government over the use of COVID data. So that's us. I can see from my screen we've got Gail back. Gail, are you back with us?
I am. I'm very sorry. I was having connection problems there, Ed. Thanks for doing that introduction on us. And just to take over, we today are going to talk a bit more about the review of the exams process that we published in March of this year. And with this review, we've explored the approaches taken to awarding grades last summer. And we did this to identify the wider lessons for those working with statistical models and algorithms. And I should say just at the start as well, we really enjoyed working with the qualifications regulators, and most of them we hadn't really worked closely with before, and we found that they all acted with honesty and integrity in what was very difficult circumstances. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So as you'll all probably be aware, last year, because of coronavirus, UK exams were cancelled, and instead grades were calculated using a mixture of teacher assessed grades, but also, as we all know, statistical models were used as well to standardise the results. And we all saw headlines in the papers come August: statistics have ruined my life. And we also started at this time to hear phrases such as mutant algorithm being used, and they were being used as a way to apportion blame. And basically the statistical modelling decisions that were made last summer had a very fundamental impact, and for some children a lasting impact. And it's quite hard, particularly as a regulator, to think of another time when statistical models have had such public impact before. And we probably, you know, most people, you know, us included as the public, we never really thought about them before, or particularly felt that we hadn't been affected by them. And also what's important to note is our review covered all 4 countries of the UK, and there wasn't, while there's been focus on Ofqual's model, there wasn't just one statistical model, and the approaches actually adopted in each of the countries did have similarities, but were also different. But I think the thing that we want to talk to you more about today is that none were able to succeed in securing public confidence. If we just go back one slide, Reema, we've just jumped ahead a little bit. There's one before this slide, which just explains a little bit of the context of why we decided to undertake this review. So all of you who are working in this area will know that statistical models and algorithms are increasingly becoming part of public life. And we really believe that as technology and the availability of data increases, that there can be very big benefits in the public sector using these kind of models. But it is quite clear to us that there has been a negative rhetoric has developed around algorithms. And why we've got involved is our role at OSR is to uphold confidence in statistics. So it's very clear to us that public confidence in statistical models and algorithms has been damaged by the experiences last year. And our worry is that people will be less likely to use these kind of models for fear of a public backlash. So that's the main reason why we looked in detail at the approaches. It wasn't to pull apart, to judge what others have done, but it's basically to get a much better understanding of what caused things go wrong, and really so that everybody can learn from it. And it's worth just flagging on this slide, the last bit of the slide, at the heart of what we do is the code of practice. The code of practice is all about ensuring that statistics serve the public good. And what this means that when we do a regulatory review, it means that it's a balanced one. So our reviews, our approaches focus on the technical issues, but quite importantly, we also consider the public, the broader context. So the public dialogue, public understanding, and public acceptance. And it's this kind of socio-technical approach that you'll see across a lot of the work that we do. It's built into the code of practice, and we feel it's allowed us to contribute to quite a unique position on this debate. So next slide, please, Reema. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on exploring the key factors that we found through our review that impacted on public confidence. So the first one is around confidence in the model. So all models have limitations and uncertainty. And I think if we take ourselves back to last year, it was a unique time, and there was resource constraints, there were a lot of challenge. But we felt when we looked, there was a high confidence placed in the model that a model could deliver a single grade to all students on a single day, whilst also not disadvantaging any groups. In addition, the next one is around transparency of the model and its limitations. So the regulators took lots of communication effort, but there was what we felt limited transparency. So full details, as we all know when reading in the press, of the model weren't published in advance. But one of the things around that was a desire not to cause uncertainty in this new time for students who were going through this new process. But in our view, the limitations of the general limitations of statistical models, and also uncertainty in the results of them, weren't fully communicated to the public. And possibly had there been more public discussion of limitations, and also most importantly, the mechanisms that were being used to overcome the limitations of the model, such as the appeals process, it may have helped to support public confidence in the results. Then technical challenge. So we saw lots of collaboration in terms of technical challenge, and this was largely with the qualifications and education context, experts in those fields. There was more limited statistical challenge in the wider field, and this is where we heard possibly some dissenting voices come through. The methods weren't exposed to the widest possible audience, but we fully do acknowledge, and in particular in the report, that there were time constraints to doing this in this particular case. The other factor to consider is the impact of historical data. All 4 countries had different models, but all 4 countries used the previous grades at schools and centres as an input. And within this historic attainment, there are patterns, so well-known patterns between how different groups, the attainment between different groups. And because these were used in the model, these fed through to the results. And this created a public perception that the model had created bias. And there was limited public discussion and limited public awareness in advance of these underlying patterns in the data, and also how they might impact on the results. The next factor was quality assurance. We saw lots of really good examples of good quality assurance of input data and output data. But what we saw was largely at an aggregate level and with limited quality assurance of individual results. This meant that when the results were published and the media focus, which was on these individual cases, so particularly on individuals where their grades were substantially different from the teachers, we felt that there was possibly that could have been predicted earlier in the model development. Next is public engagement and testing. And there was a wide range of public engagement and testing. But what we found when we looked into it, that testing largely focused on the processes of calculating the grade, and rather than the impact that was going to have. And this, one thing that came out, for instance, as you know, Scotland came first. And it was only after Scotland issued its results, people felt that they were able to see themselves in the process and what might happen to themselves or their child. Next one is broad understanding. In any normal year, statistical evidence and also expert judgment are used to set grades. So grades, you know, pass rates go up and down. But there was limited understanding of what happens in a normal year in this case. And this resulted in this perception that things were possibly more novel than they were, when actually there is statistics underlying the process normally. And the last one is human in the loop. And human in the loop can mean lots of things to lots of people. What we saw was, we saw clear human involvement in setting the model, the parameters, the coding, human involvement in checking the results, and some in feeding back the parameters. But what we found was the models tended to make the decisions rather than to support decisions in this case. And it could be that there been more involvements in the final, more involvement of humans in the final grade. This may have improved public confidence in the output. So that was the kind of key factors we found from specifically looking at the exams. Can we have the next slide, please? What's really important though, in this, the main point of doing our review, was what does this actually mean for those who are developing models? And we found 3 principles that support public confidence. And in our report, underneath each of these 3 principles, there's actually 40 learning points for others looking to work in this way. So the first principle is around be open and trustworthy. So it's about ensuring transparency about the aims of the model and also the model itself. So that touches on the limitations, being open to and acting on feedback, and ensuring the use of models is ethical and legal. And the second key point is being rigorous and ensuring quality throughout. So that's around ensuring clear governance and accountability, bringing in those subject matter experts and technical experts when developing the model, and also making sure the data and the outputs of the model are quality assured at the level that they're going to be used at. And then lastly is around meeting the need and providing public value. So that's around engaging with commissioners of the model, making sure and considering that a model is actually the right approach, and also testing the acceptability of the model. And for those of you that know the code of practice very well, you might recognise TQV, trustworthiness, quality and value in these. But what is interesting is we actually had a bit of an open book when we did this. And actually this was a bottom-up approach, but it just goes to show how well the code does stand up for cases like this. I'm just going to move on, Reema. So as well as looking at lessons for others developing models, we also need to consider the big picture. So what we found are some lessons for the centre of government. We found that it's really not always clear when you're working in this area what guidance is relevant and where you can go for support. As we all know, there's a lot of different organisations in this space, and this means it sometimes can be confusing to work in, particularly if you're new to model development. There's also a level of inconsistencies with regards to terminology, and it's also quite hard sometimes to find out who is doing what in this space. We also found that there was quite limited guidance and also practical case studies around public acceptability and transparency of models. And we also feel that there is a lot of really great support available, but it should be a bit clearer and easier to access. So I'm just going to close the talk by talking through the changes we'd like to see to happen. So next slide, please. So what we are recommended is at the highest level, we feel that there should be clearer leadership from government, and we're calling on the analysis function and digital function, but working with the administrations of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to ensure they provide consistent joined up leadership on the uses of models. And to support this, we recommend that those working in this area collaborate. And I know there's a lot of collaboration that goes on already, but particularly around the guidance area. And we see CDEI having a role in this and kind of bringing together the guidance that is developed, and also looking at the gaps. So, you know, possibly in the public acceptability space. And we also recommend that any public body who are doing sort of advanced statistical models which have a high public value should consult the national statistician and the resources within that structure, such as the data science campus and the data ethics support available there as well. So can I just move on to the last slide, please, Reema? I'm just going to finish up by saying I thought it would be really helpful to signpost some of the other work that we're doing in this area. The review of our exams supports our wider work in OSR as part of our automation and technology programme. And we've got Michael here to answer some questions if you have that at the end. As part of this programme, we are going to be clarifying OSR's role and the code when statistical models are used. And we're currently just finalising some guidance about models in AI in the context of the code. And most importantly, we are really looking forward to working with the other organisations in this space and embedding our recommendations of our review. So that's it from me today. Thank you, Reema. And we're very happy. I'm also joined today by Ed Humpherson, who's Director General of OSR, and Michael Hodge, who leads our Automation and Technology programme. And we'll be very happy to take questions on anything at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail. I really appreciate it. That was an excellent introduction to the report's findings and recommendations. I want to hand it now to my colleague, Reema Patel, who will walk through some of the research that we've been doing at the Ada Lovelace Institute on participatory forms of enhancing public confidence.
Hi, everyone. So I'm incredibly interested in some of the findings that have come out from this report and found it incredibly thoughtful and stimulating. So I just wanted to congratulate and compliment Gail on her presentation. What I'm doing here in this presentation is just taking a bird's eye view of the landscape, particularly last year, and building on a lot of our public engagement, public deliberation work in order to answer this question: what helps us build public confidence in data-driven systems? So there's a real synergy here. And next slide. So just a bit about the Ada Lovelace Institute. We use 3 core approaches. We build the evidence base to think about the impact of data-driven technologies on people and society. We also convene diverse voices. So it's that piece of the work, piece of the jigsaw that I'll be speaking to. And these 2 approaches help us change and shape policy and practice. And so it's great to be part of this conversation and conversation with many of you here today on that matter. How do we convene diverse voices? That's a really broad range of approaches that we use and we deploy. And we think of our approaches both participatory and mixed method. So from the left-hand side, you can see that we undertake a range of attitude surveys and understand people's attitudes quantitatively. So here, some of our work on data recognition technology, but also the impact of the pandemic on different groups of people in society is a really key example, or 2 key ways in which we've done that. Last year, we obviously had to respond to the constraints and the pressures of the pandemic, and prototypes a new model of deliberating with the public through rapid online public deliberation. So here you've got an example of a convened dialogue that we pulled together, and that was agile, rapid, online. We're thinking about the uses of data-driven technologies such as contact tracing, such as immunity certificates, they were called then at the time, now vaccine passport, and all of that work had been written up and published today. There's also been pre-pandemic, but also we took these approaches into a hybrid during the pandemic stage. There's also a range of deliberative approaches that we have used, such as citizen juries, citizen council, and public dialogue. And here we think of this as longer term public deliberation that brings the whole system, including policymakers and practitioners, into a room to have a conversation with people about technologies, what would be or would not be okay when it comes to the governance of technology. And a key example of something which we published quite recently is the Citizens Biometric Council. And last but absolutely not least, there is a really live conversation about the role that technologies can play in exacerbating inequality, but also in addressing inequalities. And as part of that, we're working very closely with a range of underrepresented perspectives to understand the impact that data-driven systems have on them. So through the Biometric Council, we ran workshops, for instance, on gender identity and the impact of systems on gender identity, and also on racialized groups and minoritized groups. Where do we see public trust and confidence being part of this? And the way we think about this is as a virtuous circle. So when we have data systems that are underpinned by a strong sense of trust and confidence from everyone, we know that we've got certain things right beforehand. We know that we've got representative, inclusive and proportionate data and governance, and underpinning that is the mandate for support and active participation in governing data. And the reason I've represented this here as a feedback loop is because it's incredibly important for that to happen, because it then has a knock-on impact on us being able to engender fairer, more equitable outcomes from the uses of data systems. And then that feeds into the beneficial impact that then also impacts in turn on more representative, inclusive and proportionate approaches to data and governance. And what this feedback loop highlights is that quality is not disconnected from this notion of trust and confidence, and neither is effectiveness, that they're really connected. I wanted to offer a few reflections on the pandemic, and here the source of the data is from the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a longitudinal trust barometer that has been going for at least 10 years. And so we can see here that globally, the pandemic did impact on trust level within technology, and the UK was not exempt from that. So between May 2020 to January 2021, we saw a 12-point drop compared to a range of other countries. So this is part of a global trend that we're wrestling with. And the same trust barometer indicated that willingness to share personal data to respond to the pandemic declined over that period of time. And there was globally a 6-point decline in the percent of people who said they were willing to give up more of their personal and health and location tracking information to government than ordinarily is the case. So of course this to some extent it is about technology, but it isn't just about technology. So we are beginning to see reports, and I'm referencing here an off-course study, reports that trust in GCSEs and also increasingly trust in the way teachers award marks have been affected by the exam situation, the fiasco around the exam scandal and off-qual. So you have a situation where 27% of respondents agreed that GCSEs are trusted this year, compared to 75% in a normal year. And so what this highlights is that socio-technical impacts, really, that certainly trust in technology is an important thing to consider, but also the technology and the trust in technology impacts upon the wider system and how the wider system is received. I really loved, and I pulled this bit out of the study that Gail was speaking about, but I really loved this particular quotation that illustrates that public confidence is not just about the key technical aspects of the model, neither is it about the quality of the comms strategy, but it's about considering public confidence as part of an end-to-end process, from designing to use a statistical model through to deploying the statistical model. So just a few points that have come from a range of our public deliberation initiative. There's 4 key points that really emerged through the lockdown debate initiative that was considered at a time of crisis. We were asking what would build confidence in crisis. The first was about the evidence base. So how do these technologies work? What impact do they have? Do we know enough about that? Evaluation, all of that, that's really important. Secondly, processes to offer independent review and assessment of the technology. So my colleague Andrew is leading a programme of work here at the Ada Lovelace Institute about how how do we ensure that we're more anticipatory, we're assessing the impact the technologies have before they're used and implemented. So what does participatory impact assessment in this context look like? What does impact assessment that looks at affected groups and communities here look like? The third was around boundaries when it comes to data sharing, data use, rights and responsibilities, clarity about that. People felt this was very important in the context of the fact that it was a crisis where there might be less clarity than ordinarily is the case. And last but not least, a lot of people were really concerned about the risk of adverse or disproportionate impact on vulnerable groups, on minoritized and racialized groups, largely because of questions that they had around the quality of data sets that were held about different groups and different people in society. So those were key themes that emerged. There's also another report that we highlighted quite recently that reinforces a lot of the key themes that Gail has spoken about, and really about the apps and the technology being judged as part of a system they're embedded into. The neutrality, so always being aware that technologies aren't always viewed as neutral, so they're always part of that broader socio-technical system. The point that trust isn't just about data or privacy. That technology needs to be effective and respond to particular needs. I feel that that came out very strongly and echoes a lot of the work that Gail's spoken about. Recognising that data is often about people's experiences and expressions of identity, and these are quite complex. They may be fluid, so data systems may not always necessarily comprehensively capture that or respond to that, being aware about that, and the proactive role that technologies can play. So they can, when well designed, thoughtfully designed, help us to proactively address bias and protect against bias. And those were really some key themes that emerged. That's all from us. I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I'm really interested to hear what your questions are, and looking forward to sharing more shortly.
Thank you so much, Reema. I think some really interesting points to connect between the two different threads. One being this notion of human in the loop, and a question there being which humans and which loop. I think there's a very valuable insight and connection there between participation and the types of decisions that are made by these systems. We got a few questions in the chat already, but if you'd like to add any more, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I'd like to welcome Ed Humpherson and Michael Hodge into the conversation to help answer some of these questions. And if I may, I'd like to start with one question that came up, which was what measures are necessary to put in place to ensure more accountable and transparent uses of algorithms? There was a point made by Gail in your presentation about transparency being very key. And I'm curious if there's very specific learnings or practices that other public service organizations can put in place to ensure that they're meeting those kinds of requirements in future.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'll give an initial answer and then invite Gail to kind of link what I say back into the report findings, if that's okay. So I think I fear, Andrew, that our answer to lots of these questions is going to revolve around the same kind of core proposition. And the same core proposition is that if you break the problem of deploying sophisticated statistical algorithmic models down into component parts and pick out one part and say that's the bit we've got to fix, you're probably going to find that you run into difficulties. So I think if you just say let's fix transparency of the way the algorithm works, take that out, you can come up with some fixes, but I think you might be missing other things like the acceptability of the whole process, or the sort of understanding of the preceding environment pre the use of the model. What is the model replacing? So it's for that reason that we'd say actually the way to think about this is end to end. When you're moving from one system to another, and the new system has a greater component of statistical modeling or reliance on statistics, you need to think about this notion of the public kind of engagement with that throughout. So there are some specific things on transparency, but I kind of wouldn't privilege transparency separate from all of the other things as an answer. Gail, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Just to add, and yes, I agree with you, Ed, that we are going to be talking about probably quite a lot of our answers, the fact it's not about doing one or two things brilliantly. And I hope that came out clearly in the talk. It is very much about looking at this full end-to-end process. And I was just actually having a little look at our 40 learning points, and actually there's transparency across a lot of them in a lot of the areas. So yes, it's one of these things that just needs to be thought about in a lot of steps and a lot of processes along the way.
Very interesting points. I want to take a question now from the audience, and I can see there's a question here about how do you think the wider use of data models and data during the pandemic has impacted on public perceptions around modeling? For example, modeling COVID deaths or different epidemiological models. Do you think this has had any impact on the exam result situation? I'll pass that to you, Ed, and then Reema, I'd love you to come in as well. But that's...
Yeah, so I suppose my sort of starting point in answering that, Andrew, is to say, I think let me put it this way. I have built the last few years going around to lots of audiences saying, you know what, all of this statistical analysis, it's not just for elite decision makers. It's a public asset. It's for the public. That the public are both the subject and the beneficiary of lots of these models. So we shouldn't forget that these things are for the public good, not for just efficient decision making. That's just one element of the public good. And I always sense when I give this sort of rather impassioned advocacy of this, that my audience's eyes glaze over, or they slightly sort of think that's a kind of like a fantasy. You know, in the real world, what matters is kind of policymakers making policy decisions. And what I think we've seen in the pandemic is that we're right, actually, that we're right, that on certain profound issues, the public deeply care, not just about what's happening to them, but what's happening to them relates to what's happening to their broader community. And that, of course, is the job of statistics, is to give a picture of the broader community, the aggregate picture. And so you see, extraordinary levels of engagement, for example, with the coronavirus dashboard. I think I heard from Public Health England that they're up to well over 20 million hits on that dashboard through the course of the pandemic. You see in the media, in outlets which would normally feature graphs and statistics and data as prominently, very, very prominent presentations of statistics and data, because there's an intense public interest in this. And I think the algorithm story of, and I hesitate to say algorithm, we always try and say statistical models to rescue this story from the kind of pejorative sense that the algorithm has. When we talk about the exams use of statistical models, I think we see this again. We see this sort of intense public interest, not just what's happening to me, but what's happening to the community, and that's the sort of the generic aggregate picture. So I think that in a way, the pandemic has taught us many things about public health and our how we live our lives and our exposure to sort of exogenous risk and so on. I think it's also taught us both the importance of data and statistics in our kind of civic life, and also the need for humility in the face of the data. I think those two things are really crucial lessons that I've learned. And I suppose the really interesting thing for us, and I'm not sure if this even answers the question, but I'm on a roll now, so I'm going to say it. Really the interesting question for us is this going to be a one-off moment in kind of societal history when suddenly data became important, and then everything went back to that scenario where people think data are for elite decision makers and not for the general public? Or is this a secular shift in interest? I believe it's the latter. I believe it's a secular shift, and in some ways part of our work is to sustain that shift and to get producers and presenters of data to recognize that is a sustained shift and to serve it. So yeah, there's a lot in that. As you can see, I'm quite enthused by the question of linking this all into the broader pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, Reema, I'm curious how you'd respond to that. A lot of the work you've done, I know, has been around this notion of health inequalities in light of the pandemic. I mean, how do you feel about about this question around how COVID might change the context or the understanding of these challenges?
Well, the reason I presented those slides earlier on the Edelman barometer of trust is I think it's so interesting to see that at the time that that tech has accelerated when it comes to use and deployment and used by everybody, more or less, or at least a rather large significant proportion of the population. at that particular time, you're also seeing this challenge around trust, and so that really illustrates the extent to which trust is really important. But there seems to be a dynamic that's at play in the pandemic that suggests that has declined, and so that's really worth interrogating a bit further as to understanding what it is that is contributing to that decline. The point about legitimacy is really important as well. So it's not just that the technology needs to work well for us, but also that people need to feel it works well for us, for it to work well for us. I mean, examples during the pandemic illustrate that quite well. We need, if the contact tracing app is going to be effective, then there needs to be a sense that we feel that it is effective. And the we is a really interesting point to interrogate, which is who is it that it is working for? And this is where the work on the data divide comes into play. A lot of our public attitude work recently demonstrated or illustrated a big disconnect between the different demographic groups who were benefiting from or downloading apps such as symptom tracking apps and so on. So that's a really interesting thing that is a collective responsibility, not just the responsibility of one person. The ONS is doing a really interesting piece of work through the Inclusive Data Task Force, which we're feeding into as well, and working to influence as well.
Thank you very much, Reema. I think it's very good points. I want to take another question from the audience. I feel like I am just picking the announcements for now, but I will get to the rest, I can assure you. I think this one's coming as quite interesting. There's been a lot of op-eds claiming that there was no fair way of fully automating the exam process, and that building an algorithm in the first place was just wrong. I'm curious what the panel's opinions are about this. Would there have been a right way to build this algorithmic model, or was the decision to use a model in the first place inherently flawed? And I know it's a bit of a tricky one. Ed, Gail, Michael, would you like to start us off?
I'll give an initial view and then see if Gail and Michael want to come in. So as we were doing this work, debate raged internally, and we had a very eminent expert oversight group featuring, I think, 3 past presidents of the Royal Statistical Society. And the debate was, were the 4 bodies across the UK set an impossible task, or were they set merely an incredibly difficult task? That was really the question. And at times we thought that actually this was an impossible task, because there would always be the outlier which would trigger a degree of public sense of unfairness, and that sense of unfairness would sort of generate sufficient loss of public confidence that it would always inevitably unravel. There were, of course, limitations in the data, and nobody ever tried this before. And then the other school of thought was not impossible, merely very difficult, and that there was a pathway through this that might have got to a more acceptable result. Our report lands in the latter, without at all downplaying the enormous difficulties that the organisations faced. And I should say, not producing a mutant algorithm, they didn't. They produced really good, technically well thought through approaches. There were ways through that might have produced a different outcome, but not downplaying the challenges they faced. But I'm really interested in my colleagues' thoughts on this, because, as I say, debate did rage about this. Gail, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a huge amount extra to add, Ed, but yes, we did, so I think what should be very clear from what Ed has said is we didn't go into this review with any sort of set expectations of what we were going to find, or with any sort of judgment. And I'd hope, we come across with this balanced view. So it was very much we just looked at what was there, and we didn't go back and, it's not within our remit to look within the policy decisions. And it was very much looking at this, at the processes that were involved. And as Ed said, very mindful this was done in a very short space of time in difficult circumstances. But yeah, we did have those debates as Ed was outlining there.
So, sorry, Michael, please. Yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Sorry, I was just going to. For me, it'd be a shame if this was something that shut the door on the use of algorithms to try and get to a fairer society. I do believe that we can develop algorithmic systems to be fairer, but I think we have to look at fairness from a whole perspective. Fairness here was thought about in terms of the impact, which was bad, but also fairness has to be thought about in terms of your design of that algorithm and what happens afterwards. And if there was a fair system in place where people could appeal after these type of things have happened, then I believe that is another step into fairness. So it's not just that, is that initial result fair, but are the steps we've taken before it and are the steps we're going to take afterwards, are they fair as well?
Yeah, it's a very, very good point, Michael. And I think it raises a challenging question of fair to whom. But I think that point around that focus on a systems approach to fairness, about the socio-technical concept that this is a complex system that's integrating into a complex environment, which raises all kinds of bias issues along the pathway, is a very important one to flag. Gail, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to flag that towards the end, when I was summing up what we'd like to see happen, this notion of public acceptability, which fairness is tied up into, is an area that we see needs some work. We do need to put some flesh on the bones, and I know people, and probably people on this call, are looking at these issues, but it is an area that, yeah, we think needs to be explored further.
Thank you. Reema, would you like to come in on this point? Yeah, please, I'd love to hear your perspective.
But just very brief, I think that there's certainly lessons to be learned from the way that this, the last year's conversation have gone. That's why we're having this call. I'd be reluctant to say that an algorithm should never be used, because I think, going back to that point about the socio-technical systems, it's actually about its use and its deployment, what it's designed to do, the nature of the human interactions with it, and most importantly, the way in which people are involved in the development and use and the designs of the system. It's fair to say, certainly from our perspective, that we're still, as a society, working these things out. I think this report, the review, it takes us a step forward in that direction. But the crucial point is, how do we use 2020 as a learning opportunity for us to build on, so that we can do what we're here to do, which is to ensure that we have just and fair socio-technical systems.
That's a great point, Reema. It actually flows into, I think, the next question, which was submitted by Peter Kemp from KCL, which is thinking of this year, which is fairer on students? Is it to use this year's teacher allocated grade or last year's CAG plus algorithm?
I'm actually going to pass that directly on to Gail, because I think, Gail, you probably thought about this a little bit more than I have. Other than to say that I think it's definitely a good question to ask. I suppose the one little kind of nuance I place on the question is, I'm not sure whether fair is the way that we'd quite think about it. I think we'd more say which is the one which is more likely to land in a way that that is accepted and acceptable by the public. I think that's the way. I think we'd focus a little bit more on that public confidence space. But Gail, what are your reflections on?
I think one of the main reflections I would have between last year and this year, and this isn't a fudge answer, by the way, but it's the fact that it's brought questions of fairness to the fore. Now, there has been discussions in the past around fairness of the existing system, and some of those have come out. And so I think actually it's a really good thing, because it brings everything to out in the open, so we can have these kind of discussions, and the experts and the education experts, and have these types of discussions, because at the heart, what we are very concerned around is the modeling and the use of the algorithms and how that's come about, and the fact that the dirty word element. And I think, models and statistical models have got an element to play in this fairness. And we will go back to a situation as well where we are using, albeit this year, we're not using algorithms, and that's been quite clear in some of the messaging. We will be going back into a normal situation where algorithms and modeling are used, but they're used behind the scenes. And will that have changed the public perception of fairness? And will there be different processes in place? I'm not sure. So for us, definitely as a regulator, bringing these issues out and having these kind of discussions is excellent for us. Thanks.
It's a very good point. I do wonder if there's a distinction to draw between fairness and justice, where when you think of fairness, we sort of think of a particular outcome or a particular sort of rubric or metric in the system, but where we think of justice, it's perhaps a bit of a slightly different outcome that we're looking at. And Reema, I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that, sort of that notion of where fairness ends and questions of justice pick up.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I really don't want to do a crash course in political philosophy, but fairness is a concept that has been critiqued for a few different reasons. I think that's a valid point being made by Ed. I think in terms of this question of justice, but the sort of who is it, the way we think about it is who is it that is benefiting from the uses of data-driven systems and technology, and thinking about this as not just making assumptions about the beneficiary group, but recognizing that there might be differential levels of benefiting from the way a technology is being designed, and being aware of these asymmetries of power that might exist when we're designing or developing an algorithmic system. So with the exam model, obviously, I mean, that seems quite stark in a way, the people who are out on the street versus the people who are involved in designing and developing the systems. And what we're really interested in is how do you begin that deliberation or that dialogue, what that looks like in a system, in order to enable a clear sense of what societal consensus would look like in designing these sorts of systems. Why we use approaches like the Citizens Biometric Council or lockdown debate, that notion of when you create a context in which you bring the whole system together in the room, you're much more likely to design AI systems that work for people and society. And design around different standpoints and perspective. So that's a really long answer, but so that's how we think about just and fair, but it might be quite different to the way other people think about just and fair.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, Reema, and I can see the comment as well in the chat about accountability being another consideration here, really getting to that notion of not just how you hold these systems to account, but also how do you prevent harm from occurring in the first place, making them more thinking of impact prior to the harm occurring. I want to take another question from the audience, which was from Hannah Spiro, and Reema, I think we'll start with you. I think it touches upon the Edelman survey that you'd mentioned in your presentation. To what extent do you think we are accurately able to measure and track changes in public trust towards the public sector use of algorithms? Are surveys and focus groups a good way to do that, or are there other methods we should consider?
It's a great question. So it's quite difficult to track and measure trust, I think, but I think that there's something really interesting about making a range of mixed methods approaches to understanding this approach. So some of the longitudinal surveys are really useful and helpful. Some of the more qualitative pieces of work are really useful and helpful as well. The Edelman Trust Barometer is incredibly useful because it looks at the trend across the international context and the landscape, and aims to understand global trends. And I think that's quite helpful when you're thinking about levels of trust. The other dimension around trust that's really important to think about is trust in what and trust in who. So what I find quite interesting through that survey is the focus on technology, or the focus on the sector, focus on the institution, those sorts of things. Through that, I think you can become much more granular, much more specific about what it is that you're trying to measure. If I try to poll people and ask them about their levels of trust, I think that would give us a very limited sense of information about that. But if I were to be much more contextual about that, and in this case, users and applications of data, I think there's more to be said. And also much more around that mixed methods approach. So the public deliberation work that we do aims to really understand not just the what's, so what is it that people are feeling or thinking, but the why, what's contributing to that, what are the conditions that are leading to that, and get into a much more advisory space. So how would you suggest or think about what you'd expect policymakers or decision makers to do, those 4 principles or conditions, which is a very different thing to the sort of thing that you get from a poll or an attitude survey. But I'm very happy to talk more about that outside of the scope of this discussion as well.
I think it's a very good point, Reema. I think it raises this tension we're talking about between quantitative data that feeds a model and the kind of rich contextual information that helps explain the gaps in that data. I want to take one last question before we might have to wrap up. And this is one for everyone on the panel. I'd love to just go around, just going to do rapid fire last few minutes. And that question is kind of going us back to the original report. I'm curious if we could, reflecting on the discussion today and the report's findings, what measures do you think are necessary to put in place to make sure that these systems are more accountable, transparent, and just going forward? What would you say are your main learnings and one key thing you'd like to see organizations like Ofqual put in place in future?
Shall I go first, Andrew? Yeah, so in a kind of 1 minute quickfire version, I'd say, and it's not just organisations like Ofqual, there are 3 other regulators in other parts of the UK, and of course many other public sector organisations. They should think trustworthiness, quality and value. They should apply that code of practice. Anything they're doing which is relating to the way something is going to impact on a public discourse or public acceptability, think TQV. Don't just think technical, don't just think quality, think trustworthiness, quality and value. That's my 1 sentence remedy.
Thank you so much, Ed. Gail, would you like to go next?
I would. Thanks very much, Andrew. For me, I just wanted to draw out one of the kind of key things that we raised at the end was around support. So there's lots of people in this space. There's lots of great people in this space. There's an emerging body of best practice, and actually it's worth saying that we did have an internal discussion about what are we going to write a best practice report for this exam review, and we're like, no, we're not. That's for others to do. And to kind of I think if we were an analyst sitting in this space, we want it to be easy and clear, and that support structure to be working for them to make that system work.
Thanks, Gail. Michael.
For me, it's I think we've got a lot better in recent years about collection of data and data usage and being transparent about that with GDPR. We've been good at the outputs of statistics recently and showing that end of the spectrum, but we're missing that middle bit. And I think that was apparent with this work, was we didn't really get to see the inner workings of the algorithm, the model. We couldn't scrutinize it. We couldn't learn from it as much as we probably should have been able to. So I think being more transparent about kind of sharing our practices in our coding, in our algorithms, etc., it will allow us to be better producers of algorithms going forward.
Thanks so much, Michael. And Reema.
I was also about to build on the point about transparency, but also transparency for what and for what purpose. So not just that the algorithm needs to be open, but also to sort of think about what level of openness, and then what is it that a subject to whom the decision it relates to could do about a decision. Would there be an accountability process or procedure there? That seems like a really live and interesting thing to think about in the development. So that's certainly about transparency, but there's some really interesting work on what does transparency look like, and we're just about to publish an event so I publish a report and convene an event very shortly on participatory data governance that said that transparency is that fundamental building block that enables more inclusive and dialogic approaches to the design of these data systems.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Reema. I want to say thank you again to all of our guests today and all of our attendees for joining. A mass thank you to Ed Humpherson, Michael Hodge, Gail Rankin, and Reema Patel for joining us. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can on Twitter. We are at Ada Lovelace Inst and at Stats Regulation. We'll all see you there. Have a lovely rest of your Thursday. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.